Welcome to Awaken Florida. I'm your host, Dave Ramaswamy. Today, I'm very thrilled to have with me Dr. Sharad Paul, all the way from New Zealand. And he's a skin cancer specialist, a very successful surgeon, and he's also a published author and professor. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's my first time to Florida.
Wonderful. You're welcome. What awakens you?
I think at the moment it's probably a lack of jet lag, or no. But really, I think in generally. So yesterday I was speaking at the university here on the philosophy of skin, and it's literally covers things like evolutionary biology, mind body relationships. And I think so a lot of what energizes me both in my writing is literally this exploring the narrative of link between medicine and humanities.
Oh, the interconnection between medicine and humanities.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in some ways, it's underappreciated as medicine becomes more technical.
Sure.
We stop thinking about a lot of the philosophical aspects. Or I guess like one of the things is sometimes if you don't have those kind of insights, then you are caught up in prejudices of your generation or your specialty. So
Sure.
Sometimes in certain specialties, like even within medicine, there may be overlapping conditions, but your training may dictate how you actually treat them. And I think having this kind of a broader view, and I guess being a writer, I've written both fiction, nonfiction, it sort of helps you in having a broader view.
And also some of the new research which is coming into play for skin health, which is like how gut health influences skin health. Can you speak to us about that?
Yeah, I think firstly, skin is our only universal organ. So I think it's actually even more fundamental. So there's some creatures which eat through their skin, literally, because they are very primitive creatures. So we have no creature which doesn't have a skin, but they're creatures which have no guts. They're creatures have no brains. They're creatures have no hearts. So really, that skin cell, from an evolutionary biology perspective, as our bodies became more complex, has both a skin neural connection and also a skin gut connection. But fundamentally, I think skin reflects what's going on underneath. So I've often said in my books, you can't have bad health and good skin. So when you're referring to gut, so the gut, more in recent times of people have realized gut function is so important, and there's talk about leaky gut and things like that. But in actual fact, we know in skin there is leaky skin. So we know that the transepidermal water layer or tube, we know that people who have if you don't have a proper barrier, then you get conditions like eczema and various things. So we've often known that. And I guess the other thing was increasing is to skin and nerve cells in the human embryo develop at the same time, the 7th week of intrauterine life. So skin and brain cells. So because skin is the only organ you can't live without. So for example, you can live without hearing, smell, taste, vision, but you can't live without touch.
Sure.
Right. So I think, therefore, my interest in this evolutionary biology and the link between the others, actually, I suppose I'm more biased towards a lot more insight we have in skin, simply because from evolution of all creatures, it's actually the most primitive, but also the most consistent organ we have.
Oh, that's a very profound point. I did not know that before. Thank you for making that link and connection, especially the neural link.
Yeah, it's very much so. So that, as you know, like you can even take that one step further, and we know the differentiation between acute conditions and, say, chronic ones. So for example, if you're under acute stress, you get skin breakouts and things like that because
Sure.
the mites you have in your skin react to it. And then if you have chronic stress, we know that chronic stress at a cellular level has the same oxidant pathway, oxidative damage, which like injury or inflammation.
Incredible.
And aging. So we know that, in fact, a lot of my research into aging things, we feel that, chronic injury, if you're not addressing chronic injury, if you've got a tumor like cancer, if you're under chronic stress, that can also make you age. So I think they're all kind of interconnected in more ways than we think. And that's a problem sometimes in if you don't take this view and you get so specialized in one area, you stop thinking outside your frame. And yeah, sometimes you have to step outside.
What do you see in your practice in New Zealand and even with your travels and expertise around the world? What's the kind of, for the next decade, what's the biggest challenge when it comes to skin health?
I think, firstly, speaking of the sun, UV damage is our biggest cause of skin cancer, but also UV damage is the biggest cause of photoaging, which makes people age, especially if you're fair skinned, right? The darker our skin is, the less we age because we have more melanin. So melanin is an antioxidant, so you then don't get as much damage. But certainly, actually, where I come from, New Zealand, Australia, we actually have the highest UV indices anywhere in the world. It's because, as you know, the Earth has a bit of a tilt. So at both the poles, you have high UV radiation because the magnetic poles keep shifting, right?
Yeah.
But in the Arctic, because you got the ocean, it absorbs a significant amount. But Antarctica, being a continent, and sheets of ice reflects a lot of it back in.
Oh, yeah.
So we actually, our ambient UV is so high, like, so to compare it, like in places like Florida, you'd often get like UV index of 10, which is still maximal.
Yeah.
We would get something like 17, 18. It's like phenomenal.
That's high.
But then if you go to places like Asia or India, or places like that, the pollution filters out a lot. And then secondly, where they're located, so you'll actually find it's only like 3 or 4. So in actual fact, in a funny sort of way, you could spend more time in the sun there and not get damaged. But if you spend a lot of time in the Florida sun or in the sun belt in the US, you do get a degree of skin damage. And which, if you're fair skinned, it can lead to skin cancers, or of course, it ages your skin. And, aging is fundamentally DNA mutations accumulate over time. So that's why when we get older, we're also more prone to getting cancers. And so you were talking about older populations which migrated down. Actually, what you said is funny, because I had some dermatologists I knew here who we had co-authored papers in the past, and he used to say to me that Florida, among them, they called it God's waiting room because this is what he said.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I guess what's the challenge therefore is there is an increase we see in this generation of skin cancers because of the factor of damage which was done like 20 odd years ago, right? So there is almost an epidemic, and fortunately, in people who are darker skin, you have very low risk, but there is still a significant, America in the fair skin populations in the Sun Belt is, quite a significant risk.
I want to ask you, something's been bothering me for a while, which is a sunscreen issue.
Yes.
Now people are debating on whether the advice to wear high UV protection sunscreen over the last 30, 40 years was a mistake. And especially in the US over the last year or two specifically, there's a lot of sunscreen products that have been recalled off the market for having carcinogenic compounds. Can you speak to that?
Very much so. In fact, that is one of my research babies. Is actually, I recently wrote a paper on Frontiers of Dermatology, specifically on this issue of sunscreen regulation, and that's in fact right up my alley, and I know the space very well. And so fundamentally the issue is, why do you need sun protection? Like I said, because if you don't have sun protection, then you can get skin cancer or you can age more, and both things, the young people don't want to age more, and people who are prone to skin cancers don't want to. And then people with darker skin don't want to develop. So the darker you are, you get sun damage, but you're not going to get the cancers, but you tend to develop pigmentation and things. So people then want to use sunscreen. So fundamentally, that's how sunscreen came about. But there are two types of sunscreens, and this is quite interesting. So in my lab, we actually make sunscreens, but we only make the mineral sunscreens.
Sure.
So the mineral sunscreens are like zinc and titanium, and those are only two approved here by the FDA. And basically, if you put that on your skin, it actually forms a film on your skin. And if it forms a film on your skin, then the UV doesn't penetrate it, so therefore it protects you. So it is actually a myth. There is a myth, however, between vitamin D and sunscreen, because lots of times people who say, oh, don't use sunscreen, say because if you use it, you won't absorb your vitamin D. That's a myth. We've actually studied it. In actual fact, sunscreen doesn't block. Yeah, so that's fine. But the issue is what you're talking about is true with the chemical sunscreen. So I also don't make any chemical sunscreens in my lab, for the reason is there are a lot of hormonal chemicals in it. So if that's the case, why do you actually make a chemical sunscreen? And the reason was purely a cosmetic thing, because if you make a mineral sunscreen with a bit of zinc and titanium, it's typically a little bit more whitening. So in my lab, we have some technology. We actually sell some products where you have actually made them a little less whitening, so it's more palatable to people, but it still won't be a chemical sunscreen. You can make it in a way that it's really blends in right. Yeah. But the problem with the chemical sunscreen is you're using technology, you're using these chemicals which are UV absorbers underneath. So rather than having a filter, you are trying to save when you're absorbing the photo energy going in. But therefore, a lot of these actually secondarily have hormonal impacts on skin. So I think in this paper I referred to, there was a study done in Norway where they looked at people who spent time at the beach for 4 to 5 days and using chemical sunscreens. And after that period of time, they still found these residual chemicals in breast milk or prostate secretions and things like that. So there is evidence that we know that these chemicals, particularly the endocrine disruptors, so we know that they affect the endocrine system. The other issue has been with concern regarding nanoparticles in some of these things, in which case, because obviously, so instead of using a chemical sunscreen, that people think, what if we made the particles so small that then it's not visible and whitening? But the problem is if you make particles too small, which can get into the cell, our cells have normal channels to excrete everything else, but we never evolved to excrete sunscreen, right? Yeah. So we don't know what the effect of those are. But I think there is a concern. So personally, I don't advocate chemical sunscreens for the reason because they haven't been proven yet in any way to categorically cause anything. But the fact is, from a personal point of view, I don't want a chemical lurking around in my prostate or hormonal secretions when I don't know what it's doing even for days after. So I'd rather not just use it. The third thing, a myth I would clarify while we're on this in sunscreens, is the amount of body surface area you need exposed. So roughly it's 20%. So in other words, 20 minutes a day, 20% body surface area. So 20% is roughly t-shirt and shorts.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you covered up and you only had your face exposed, you weren't going to get enough vitamin D anyway. So a lot of people don't realize that is to get optimal vitamin D absorption. And then the second thing is this: if you spend too much time in the sun after the 20-minute, the sun damage which causes then starts destroying what little vitamin D you absorbed. So we know that short bursts several times a day is better than a whole day out in the sun. So that's why one sustained burst actually is not so good for skin. So what we normally say is 20 minutes optimal, and then 20% body area, which means like t-shirt and shorts. And then, And so the two problems is, in one case, sometimes people are not exposing enough body surface area to the sun to absorb enough vitamin D. Sure. Or secondly, they're overdoing it, which means the benefit of getting the vitamin D overcome by the damage that the UV
so
causes.
Lying in the beach for 2 hours is not a good idea.
It's not a good idea. That's right. Yeah.
Can you recommend any brands in the US? I know you have your own brand. Feel free to plug it if you ship it to the US.
It will be very soon. It'll be called just Healthy Skin Lab, actually. So it's actually very easy. But from a sunscreen point of view, but the reality is, I would say if you look for mineral sunscreens, because generally they tend to not have the chemicals. So as a general rule, look for mineral sunscreens. And because the other thing is, we know that I think certain states have, like for Hawaii, for example, like I had a patient who was carrying my sunscreen. Somebody else, her friend, was carrying a different one. They landed in Hawaii. Certain states have become aware of this. And actually at the customs, they let mine through and they
Really?
threw the other one out.
Oh, wow.
And I was
Incredible.
quite surprised when they came back. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, is it? And they were actually savvy enough to say that it damages a coral reef. And because
Oh, yeah.
so from a reef safe,
snorkelers are divers,
that kind of
yeah.
so they've actually been said so same in certain places now around the world. They're actually banning these chemical sunscreens anyway, but it's not by far the majority are still chemical sunscreens, because as with humans, right, we want something which the cosmetic look, feel like in our food sometimes is more important than
Sure.
how good it is. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, Dr. Paul, final question. What's one thing people can do to improve their skin health? Easy thing in the next 30 days.
Oh, I think the next 30 days, I would say eat less sugar would be my biggest thing, would be because we, more and more in the world now, diseases, especially in the Western populations, are diseases of overconsumption rather than undernutrition, right? So we know that sugar in a large degree, because in the body we don't need as much sugar because our skin cells make sugar from protein and various things we eat. But fundamentally, people consume too much sugar. So from a skin point of view, sugar is inflammatory. So you find that, generally it causes more inflammation. So I think if there's one thing you can do, you can cut back on a bit of sugar. So especially refined ones, like, fizzy drinks. So I think if you're drinking a lot of Coke and Pepsi and things like that, especially in America, I see that's widely, drunk more than water, high sugar content. I think cut them off. And it's the same, even bizarrely, even if you have artificial sugars, what we find is if the brain doesn't know, this is something I was writing about in the book, The Genetics of Health, which is available here, is that if the brain doesn't know, if it tastes sweets to the brain, then you're still secreting stuff in the pancreas. So they've found that even having too much artificial sweetness can still increase your risk of diabetes. Coke. Yeah, that's right. So best is just don't go for the too many sweet things, cut it down a bit.
Great. Thank you for being on the show, Dr. Paul. Look forward to having you back here. Have a safe trip back home.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.